Hello everyone. We saw that the key feature of modernity in Europe was the rejection of old medieval ideas and the adoption of new practices that emphasized rationality and scientific thinking. This defining aspect of European modernity, that is, the complete rejection of traditional values to embrace new liberal ones, was noticeably absent in Indian society. While rationality and scientific thinking from Europe influenced India's educated class, they were not ready to completely give up their traditions and conservative beliefs. In other words, an alternative form of modernity began to take shape in the country. As a result, in India, modernity and progress were not simply a clash between those who supported liberal ideas and those who defended traditional orthodox beliefs. This clearly shows the rise of an alternative modernity. In the Indian context, this alternative modernity, carefully shaped by the nationalist thinkers, was a deliberate negotiation between Western modern values and India's traditional beliefs. What is the nature of this alternative modernity? We will explore this question in this lecture. We are going to talk about how the Western modernity was replaced with the alternative modernity with a nationalist imprint on it. A blind imitation of the model of modernity based on Western norms was an important issue. The issue was that a total assimilation with the Western form of modernity will mean one's absolute transformation into Western culture. Here, the natives will not get an opportunity to ascertain their national identity. In other words, if everybody here follows the ways and manners of Europe, then it means that we have subscribed completely to the Western culture and identity. In such a scenario, what goes down the drain is the attempt to claim an Indian identity. But at the same time, the idea of modernity had to involve certain aspects of modernity in the West as well. In short, there was a growing demand for a special kind of modernity that is modern but not Western. The alternative modernity, developed by the intellectual elites in the country, represented a unique blend of select Indian traditional values and Western material values. This fusion of Eastern and Western values was not arbitrary, but it emerged from a specific rationale. It was believed that Western civilization was extremely strong in the material sphere, and this material strength had enabled European nations to subjugate non-European people and establish their dominance worldwide. To overcome this dominance, many nationalist intellectuals believed that colonized people, that is the natives, needed to learn and incorporate these superior techniques of European culture in material life. Partha Chatterjee's observation in his essay Colonialism, Nationalism and Colonized Women is very important in this context. Chatterjee observes, "It was in the material sphere that the claims of Western civilization were the most powerful. Science, technology, rational forms of economic organization, modern methods of statecraft, these had given the European countries the strength to subjugate the non-European people and to impose their dominance over the whole world. To overcome this domination, the colonized people had to learn those superior techniques of organizing material life and incorporate them within their own cultures." The nationalists firmly acknowledged or believed that Western superiority in the material domain is very important when it comes to creating a kind of modernity in India. And these Western material values are really important when it comes to the public domain. They were willing to carefully study and replicate Western accomplishments in this sphere. However, this did not imply a wholesale imitation of the West in all aspects of life, because it was believed that such an approach, that is, the total emulation of the Western ways and manners would erase the distinction between the West and the East, thereby threatening the rational cultural identity. In other words, they were very reluctant to integrate Western values into their domestic realm, where they continued to uphold the traditional values. They declared the domestic realm, that is, their home, as spiritual and sacrosanct. For the nationalist intelligentsia, home was their sovereign territory, and they strongly resisted the colonial intervention in that sphere. Chatterjee talks about it in great detail. According to him, but this could not mean the imitation of the West in every aspect of life, for then the very distinction between the West and the East would vanish. The self-identity of national culture would itself be threatened. In fact, as Indian nationalists in the late 19th century argued, not only was it undesirable to imitate the West in anything other than the material aspects of life, it was even unnecessary to do so, because in the spiritual domain, the East was superior to the West. What was necessary was to cultivate the material techniques of modern Western civilization while retaining and strengthening the distinctive spiritual essence of the national culture. Chatterjee mentions this or observes so in his article Colonialism, Nationalism and Colonized Women. If you want to take a look at this particular passage in detail, you can actually refer to the essay. Chatterjee presents Bankim Chandra as one of the first representatives of this new nationalist thought. According to him, Bankim was one of the most systematic expounders in India of principles of nationalism. In 1888, Bankim wrote a very fascinating work titled The Theory of Religion. He presents his ideas as a dialogue between the teacher and a student, just like how Plato or Upanishads frame their content. Now, here is where it gets really interesting. Bankim sees three types of knowledge that shape human understanding. The first one is the knowledge of the world. The second includes subjects like mathematics, astronomy, physics, and chemistry. He argues that the idea is that one should learn these things from West because they have made great advancements in these areas. The second one is actually the knowledge of the self. It covers disciplines like biology and sociology, helping us understand human life and society. Again, Bankim acknowledges that the West has developed these sciences better. Finally, he talks about the knowledge of God or spiritual knowledge. But here is where Bankim takes a bold stand. He declares that India is far ahead of the West when it comes to spiritual wisdom. Where does this wisdom lie? According to Bankim, it lies in Upanishads, Darshanas, Puranas, Itihasas like the Mahabharata and the Ramayana and the Gita. So, what is Bankim's grand vision? A union of Western materialism and Indian spirituality. He believes that we should reject Western scientific progress, but rather we shouldn't completely discard Western scientific progress, but rather combine it with the deep spiritual insights of India. A result, a very harmonious, holistic worldview that integrates reason and faith, science and spirituality, the material and the divine. A new nationalist thought or new nationalist culture that integrates reason and faith, science and spirituality, the material and the divine. Bankim presents this grand plan through the character of the teacher in a tract. The following conversation between the teacher and the pupil is really interesting in this regard. The teacher says, "The day the European industries and sciences are united with Indian dharma, man will be good." And then the student responds, "Will such a day ever come in the life of man?" And teacher responds, "It will, if you Indians are prepared to act. It is in your hands. If you will it, you can become master and leader of the whole world. If you do not aspire to it, then all my words are in vain. This conversation highlights the kind of national culture that Bankim wants to establish. The character emphasizes the potential for the convergence of European industrial and scientific advancements with Indian spirituality, suggesting that such a union could lead to a new culture that suits the modern time. But how this national culture could be achieved? This is where Bankim proposes his idea of Anushilana. Anushilana, which is based on the concept of bhakti, implied the unity of knowledge and duty. According to Bankim, if this knowledge has to be developed into a national culture, then it has to be connected with bhakti and duty. While bhakti demands unquestioning acceptance of the knowledge, duty or dharma will strongly inspire one to put the knowledge into practice in one's life. We know that the alternative modernity emphasized the retention of traditional values in the domestic realm. Does it mean that a blind imitation of the tradition as it was existing in the 19th century? Or does it mean that all the Hindu traditions that were existing in the 19th century should be followed as they were? We have to answer this particular question in the negative. Although the alternative modernity that the elite intelligentsia in the country developed laid considerable emphasis on tradition, they never attempted a blind imitation of the Hindu culture as it existed in the early 19th century. The nationalist intelligentsia felt that if India was to progress, she would have to change her archaic beliefs and outmoded social institutions. Chatterjee makes the same observation in other essays as well. So the reformation of the outmoded tradition, especially the Hindu tradition, was the first phase of the development of the alternative modernity. Now, the easiest possible way in front of the nationalist intelligentsia was to urge the colonial government, colonial masters to reform society and religion through legislation. But Bankim was against giving a free hand to the colonial administration in bringing about reformation in social institutions. While he argued with the reformers' criticism of certain Hindu customs and traditions and practices, he disagreed with their methods and beliefs about how reform should happen in society. He opposed the idea of asking the British government to pass laws based on reason and rationality to fix social issues. He thought that laws could not effectively bring about a real change in society. And he strongly believed that for reform to truly succeed in society, it had to come from a new moral consciousness among people. This new morality would naturally arise as society changed, making laws unnecessary for social reform. For example, he saw polygamy, that is having multiple wives, as something that was naturally declining in the Hindu society, even without any laws or religious instructions. He believed this change was a result of shifting social and economic conditions, and its eventual end was inevitable. This is where his notion of Anushilana becomes really important. Anushilana is the act of the natives adopting the new national culture developed by the elite intelligentsia with full confidence in its feasibility, as if practicing it in their lives is their dharma. The national cultural ideal of the complete and perfect man was something that had to be aspired to and approached through practice or Anushilana. However, as Bankim himself acknowledged it, it was unlikely that the vast majority of people could ever attain this perfection. Chatterjee observes that both the nationalists and the Westerners agree on the fact that the contemporary Indian society is in shambles. Both of them firmly believed in the need of a reform. But while the colonial masters believed that Indians are incapable of effecting a cultural change on their own in the colony, the native intelligentsia firmly believed that the Indians are not passive and they are really capable of bringing about a passive change in the country. In other words, the nationalist thought that developed in the country resisted the typical orientalist thought that the East was passive and was incapable of making a transformation on its own. But it did not reject the orientalist conception that the East needs to undergo a thorough transformation and need to get modernized very badly. Chatterjee's observation merits special attention in this regard. He observes, we find, in fact, that the problematic in nationalist thought is exactly the reverse of that in Orientalism. That is, the object in the nationalist thought is still the Orient, who retains the essentialist character depicted in the Orientalist discourse. Only he is not passive, non-participating. He is seen to possess a subjectivity which can himself make. In other words, while his relationship to himself and to others have been posed, understood and defined by others, that is, by an objective scientific consciousness, by knowledge, by reason. Those relationships are not acted by others. His subjectivity, he thinks, is active, autonomous and sovereign. At the level of the thematic, on the other hand, nationalist thought accepts and adopts the same essentialist conception based on the distinction between the East and the West. The same typology created by a transcendent studying subject, and hence the same objectifying procedures of knowledge constructed in the post-enlightenment age of Western science, unquote. This effect exhibits profound contradictions. It simultaneously imitates and harbors hostility towards the cultures it seeks to emulate. On the one hand, it mimics the values and norms of foreign cultures. However, it also involves a dual rejection that is marked by ambivalence, rejection of the foreign intruders and dominators whom it aims to emulate and surpass by their own standards, and rejection of traditional customs perceived as hindrance to progress, yet cherished as symbols of identity. This complex, contradictory process is deeply unsettling. In comparison to the nationalisms of Herder or Mazzini, Eastern nationalism is characterized by this disturbance and ambivalence, setting it apart from their more straightforward approaches. In his article Nationalism as a Problem in the History of Political Ideas, Chatterjee explains in extenso about this contradiction. His words merit a special attention in the context. He says, this attempt is deeply contradictory. It is both imitative and hostile to the models it imitates. It is imitative in that it accepts the values and standards set by the alien culture, but it also involves a rejection, in fact two rejections, both of them ambivalent. Rejection of the alien intruder and dominator who is nevertheless to be imitated and surpassed by his own standards, and rejection of ancestral ways which are seen as obstacles to progress and yet also cherished as marks of identity. This contradictory process is therefore deeply disturbing as well. Eastern nationalism is disturbed and ambivalent as the nationalism of Herder and Mazzini were not. I hope these ideas are clear to you by now. Before I sign off, let's revise in a nutshell all the major ideas that we discussed so far in this lecture. The model of modernity rooted in Western norms encountered two significant challenges in the East. Firstly, it presented the Orient as incapable of self-reform. Secondly, this uncritical imitation meant copying Western ideals without active participation from the local population. In response to this situation, nationalist elites began searching for an alternative version of modernity, which eventually evolved into the officially sanctioned concept of national identity and modernity within the colony. This model of modernity was a very curious combination of the Eastern and Western values. While the nationalist thought imitated the West in the material sphere, it followed Eastern values in the domestic sphere. The reason for this imitation was that It was material prowess of the West that had empowered European nations to conquer non-European societies and assert their global dominance. So, we should follow the Western values in the material sphere. While it is true that the West is superior in the material sphere, the East has its superiority in the domestic or spiritual realm. So, the domestic values were copied from the East. Although the elite intelligentsia in the country laid considerable emphasis on tradition in forming the alternative modernity, they never attempted a blind imitation of the Hindu culture as it existed in the early 19th century. It was believed that the outmoded traditional practices in the country are to be discarded and tradition has to be thoroughly reformed to make it look modern. So, the reformation of the outmoded tradition, especially the Hindu tradition, was the first phase of the development of the alternative modernity. I hope you have understood all the major points that we discussed today. Thank you.